Everyone, welcome to Writing Stories with myself, author L.M. Spilsbury, and my good friend, author Kimberly D. Tate.
Hello. So I guess today we were going to try something just a little different because we've been discussing how to make our videos a little more entertaining because neither one of us are very funny or scintillating. But we were talking about how our memories from childhood and the things that we bring along with us throughout life have affected how we write, and some of the scenes that were in our childhood somehow make it onto the page. And I was Louise there, she spent a good deal of her childhood in Europe and overseas, which certainly would have given you many memories to draw from and experiences. And I myself grew up around the shores of Lake Ontario. My dad was really into boats, and he decided, I don't know whatever possessed him, but he decided that he was going to build his own sailboat, and I'm talking like 36 feet. This was no small sailboat. This was a very large sailboat. And we lived in Port Louise, down in St. Catharines, and I spent the bulk of my childhood growing up around the water. And so, of course, water and piers and beaches and fishing and boats, and that all is part of my psyche. So, as well as horses, when I was younger, I was certainly bitten by the horse bug, and so was my sister. And I just wanted a horse so bad. And I know this is like totally jumping off from the water story onto horses, but horses somehow always managed to make it into my conversations. And so I remember, even as a small child, being bitten by the horse bug, and I just wanted to be around horses. I lived and ate and breathed. I was just obsessed with horses. And so I would always write stories about horses, and they always, I talked about horses, and my sister and I, we would save up our allowance, and we only got 25 cents a week, so, but of course back then 25 cents was probably, not a bad allowance. And there was a riding stable close by, but it would take us quite a few weeks, and I'm talking like, a couple of months to save up our allowance and scrounge up the money to go for a trail ride. And of course, you would just start to get the money together, but you'd always want to buy some candy too, so you'd have to like nip into your savings. And so it did take us a while, to scrounge up the money to go for this trail ride. And horses have been a big part of my life. I ended up working with dressage horses for the bulk of my working career. And so horses always seem to find their way into my stories. And, just for an example, I know quite a bit about horses, but one of my characters in my fantasy novel, Selah, well, she loves horses, but she's never even really been up close to a horse. So the first time she ever sees a horse and gets up close to it, I kind of had to think to myself, okay, I know what I would notice if I ran up to a horse, but what would she notice? Because she's never even been up close to a horse. So what would be the things that would stick out in her mind, being a totally non-horsey person, but just oh my God, a horse, she's just lived her 16 years and just wanting to be close to a horse. And this is the first time she's actually been up close to a horse. So I did kind of have to scratch my head and think, all right, now what would be the things that she would notice? So I had to like dig down deep into my long history of working with horses and think, okay, when I was a kid, and I first started to hang around horses, what were the things that I noticed about them? And so, the horse in my story, he's not neglected, but he's not had the best care, of course. So he would be a little bit bony, and, he would be kind of smelly, and maybe his feet weren't all that well looked after, and his mouth would be really slimy with, bits of grass and green slobber. So, I just drew on my childhood memories and just picked out a couple of things that would stand out in her mind. So that little anecdote, applies to a scene that I wrote in my story. So hence writing stories. So what about you? Do you have a memory that you've brought into your books at all?
Well, you shouldn't be putting me on the spot, but somehow the question is putting me on the spot. You mentioned my childhood in Europe, and what growing up for 5 years in Europe did for me was it provided me with a very different reality than I would have had if I'd grown up in Canada. Europe is very old, so buildings and institutions that we would consider ancient. I remember going to a church that was over 1,000 years old, where the stones leading down the aisle to the altar actually had a dip in them from the hundreds of years of people trooping up and down the aisle to take communion. And that's almost incomprehensible. That kind of age is incomprehensible to us in Canada, where a building that's a couple of 100 years old, even 100 years old, is considered to be very, very old, whereas to them 100 years is nothing. Mm-hmm. But as far as what has directly impacted my writing, the thing that does jump to mind is all the canal cities that I saw in Europe, specifically Venice, of course, but what I remember more is the Belgian city of Bruges, which was, I think it's called the Venice of the North, if I'm not mistaken, and how buildings are abutting almost right into the canal water. And the series that I'm just starting to work on now, called The Vampire's Household, I made a conscious decision before I started writing that I wanted to have canals in the setting. And I've had to create a fictitious city that is built around canals, and that is built in an area of low country such as Holland, and how that very geography would impact the culture and the architecture and even how people think and what they eat. So that's one example of how my childhood memories are informing my writing today. I think the thing is that you remember things through the lens of many decades, and what you remember may not be the full explosion of sensory input that you get at the time. And also, I think what you experience as a child doesn't have many of the knowledge filters that we have as adults, so that we can see something and make sense of it through a background of a lot of information about what it is we're looking at or what it is we're experiencing. But for sure, I think every writer, definitely, we write about what we know, and what we know may not be specifically that we had a career as a doctor, so we write about being a doctor, but what we know to be reality in our day-to-day lives, I think, is heavily reflected in what we write, because if we wanted to write about being a CIA operative and, we've worked in a store our whole lives, it's not that we can't do it, but the amount of research it would take to make that very believable, just from a technical point of view, is very high. But we can always speak to the reality of being afraid or being curious or being offended by something. I mean, that's something that every person experiences in their lives. So that's a little bit of my take on what our experience and how it informs us. I don't know if our audience is really interested in our personal experiences, and if you people are, please leave a comment, and we can certainly talk more about this, because one thing about having lived a lot of years is you have a lot of experience in a lot of different things, and it's a real blessing, actually, when you are an author, to have all that experience to draw on. I remember what it was like when I was writing in my 30s, and a lot of the problems I had revolved around not having enough life experience to know what a character would be doing with their days and what they would be thinking and how they would be reacting to situations outside their experience. And certainly having a little bit more life experience as a person really helps in writing a believable story, I think, at least from my point of view. What do you think, Kim?
Yeah, no, I have to agree, because I mean,
Yeah.
ultimately stories are about people, and it's the people and the
Exactly.
characters that make the story interesting. And so whatever setting you plunk them into and whatever situation you plunk them into, they're still stories about people. And otherwise we would be reading stories about buildings, which you could make as a character. There's
I
nothing to
suppose.
say that you couldn't do that. It would have
I
to be a really
suppose.
interesting building. But yes, I mean, our stories are about people, and that's the universal language, isn't it? So
It is, yeah,
we're all
exactly.
people, so
That's right.
yeah.
That's
But
right.
yes, no, I
Well,
totally agree.
yeah, if anyone in our audience has any thoughts on this topic, we'd love to hear from you. Leave a comment and be sure to press the like button and to subscribe. We haven't been very good about keeping to a schedule this past month. It seems that life has gotten in the way for one or both of us, but we're working hard to maintain a weekly schedule. So we hope to see you next week. Thanks for tuning in. Bye for now.
Bye now.